The grief was a living thing, a cold vine that had wrapped itself around Ilara's heart the day her husband died, and with every passing season, its grip tightened. It was a chill that had nothing to do with the creeping blight that stole the warmth from the ancient woods, but a deeper frost born of debt, loneliness, and fear. This feeling of a world slowly fading is something I think we can all understand on some level. I'd love to know who's sharing this moment with me. So please, comment with your name, where you're watching from, and what time it is in your part of the world. And make sure you subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. For Ilara, this journey was a daily struggle for survival. Her world shrunk to the size of a tiny, mortgaged cottage where the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke was a fragile shield against the encroaching despair. Her days were a testament to quiet desperation, a rhythm of foraging in the blighted woods, and brewing remedies that the local elves bought with suspicion in their eyes. They saw her not as a healer, but as a human taint on their fading world, a necessary evil to treat ailments their own magic could no longer touch. In the market square, their gazes were like shards of ice, their whispers following her like a plague wind. They spoke of her husband's folly, the shame of his debts, and the impurity of her blood. The cruelest glares came from the men of the local magistrate, a corpulent, sneering man, who held the deed to her land and, with it, the fate of her son, Leo. Their uniformed presence was a constant, suffocating reminder that her freedom was a flickering candle flame, easily extinguished by the slightest breeze of authority. At night, when the pale moon cast long, skeletal shadows through the trees, and Leo slept soundly in his small bed, the facade of the resilient healer would crumble. Ilara would sit by the dying embers of the hearth, the day's meager earnings a cold, mocking weight in her palm. It was never enough. The magistrate's demands were a rising tide, and she was drowning. In these silent, lonely hours, she would allow herself to feel the full, crushing weight of her reality. She was a widow, haunted by a death she couldn't explain, a mother terrified of failing her child, and a woman yearning for something she dared not name, a place to belong, a world where her hands, skilled and gentle, were valued more than the human blood that flowed through her veins. The most immediate terror had a name, Lord Valerius. The magistrate did not send his men this time. He came himself, his polished boots trampling the fragile herbs she grew by her doorstep. His presence filled her small cottage, sucking the very air from the room. He spoke of her debt not with anger, but with a predatory smoothness that was far more chilling. His eyes roamed her home, lingering on the worn furniture, and then on her, a proprietary gaze that stripped her bare. He offered an alternative to payment, a personal arrangement that would secure her land and her son's future. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air between them, a vile poison. Ilara's entire body went rigid, her hand instinctively clutching the small carving knife on the table as she positioned herself between him and the door to Leo's room. After he left, leaving behind a final ultimatum that felt like a death sentence, Ilara's strength finally gave out. She leaned against the rough-hewn door, her breath coming in ragged, silent sobs as the chilling finality of her situation settled in. She had 3 days. 3 days before Valerius would return to claim everything. The world outside was silent, the blighted woods holding their breath. Just as the first tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, a sound cut through the oppressive quiet. It was not the swaggering return of the magistrate's men, but something utterly alien to her small, forgotten corner of the realm. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from her door, 3 precise raps that spoke of discipline and power. Peeking through a crack in the shutter, her heart leaped into her throat. A lone rider on a magnificent white steed, bearing the silver and emerald crest of the elf king himself, sat waiting. The guard did not dismount. He remained on his steed, a silent, silver-clad statue whose presence was an intrusion of a world far beyond her own. His gaze was impassive, sweeping over her small, weathered cottage with an air of detached assessment that was somehow more unnerving than Valerius's leering contempt. He held out a rolled scroll, sealed with the king's own crest, the wax a vibrant, living green against the stark white parchment. His voice, when he finally spoke, was as cold and clear as a winter stream, devoid of warmth or malice. He did not state a charge or a crime. He simply announced that her presence was required at the citadel by royal decree. Leo, awakened by the sound, peeked from behind her skirts, his small face pale with a terror that assumed this was just another, more powerful version of the men who came to hurt them. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, as she took the scroll with a trembling hand. The journey was a blur of motion and memory, the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves a steady beat against the frantic pulse of her fear. As her small, blighted corner of the forest gave way to the grand, ancient woods of the elven heartlands, her mind retreated to the past, to the brief, sun-drenched season of her life with Phelan. He had been an outcast elf, drawn to her human warmth and the vibrant life she embodied, a stark contrast to the stoic solemnity of his own people. Their love had been a secret rebellion, a fragile bubble of happiness in a world that disapproved. But the elven community's rejection was a constant, chilling draft under the door of their life together, a reminder that their union was seen as an impurity, a stain on their ancient lineage. She was the human woman who had lured one of their own away, and for that they would never forgive her. Phelan's death was not a gentle fading, but a sudden, violent severing that left more questions than answers. He was found at the edge of the blighted lands, his body unmarked, but his spirit extinguished, as if his very life force had been drained away. The grief was a maelstrom, but the discovery of his debts was a second, colder death. He had borrowed heavily from men like Valerius, men who dealt in desperation and collected with interest, paid in fear. The man she had loved, who had sworn to protect her, had instead built their life on a foundation of lies and secrets. The shame of it was a physical weight, a constant companion that soured every memory of his smile and turned his whispered promises into echoes of betrayal. She was left to carry not only her sorrow, but the burden of his dishonor, a debt that was both financial and deeply, personally emotional. Every sacrifice, every moment of humiliation she endured, was for Leo. He was the only pure thing left from her life with Phelan, a bright, curious boy with his father's pointed ears and her own resilient human spirit. This duality made him a target, a living symbol of the union the elves despised. Her deepest fear was not the cold or the hunger, but the moment she would look into her son's eyes and see the light of his innocence extinguished by the cruelty of the world. She worked her fingers to the bone, brewing remedies and swallowing insults, all to build a pathetic wall of protection around him. The magistrate's threats were not just about land. They were about her ability to keep her son safe. The thought of failing him, of seeing him torn from her arms, was an agony that dwarfed all other pains. A constant, gnawing terror that fueled her desperate fight for survival. The core of her wound, the one from which all others bled, was the simple, unchangeable fact of her humanity. In the elven lands, to be human was to be lesser. It meant being seen as short-lived, emotional and impure, a creature of dirt and base needs. Her healing knowledge, passed down through generations of human women, was a paradox. They sought her remedies for the blight their own magic could not halt. Yet they scorned the very hands that prepared them. This constant, pervasive disdain had seeped into her bones, making her feel like a weed in a manicured garden. She had learned to make herself small, to avert her gaze, to speak only when spoken to. Over the years, their contempt had become a mirror, and in her darkest moments she began to see the same flawed, unworthy creature they did, forgetting the strength that resided in her human heart. The concept of love or romance was a ghost from another life, a story told to a different woman. Phelan had been her one disastrous foray into that world, and the wreckage he left behind served as a permanent warning. Her heart was not just broken, it was barricaded. The predatory interest of Lord Valerius had only reinforced her conviction that any man's desire was a weapon, a tool for control and exploitation. She could not afford the vulnerability that came with affection, the weakness of opening herself to another soul. Her purpose was singular and absolute: protect Leo. Romance was a luxury, a dangerous fire that she, a woman living in a tinderbox house of poverty and fear, could never risk lighting. Her body and soul were dedicated to survival, and there was simply no room left for the softness of a lover's touch or the risk of a shared future. The towering spires of the elven citadel pierced the sky, structures of living white wood and shimmering crystal that seemed to sing a silent, ancient song. The sheer, breathtaking beauty of the city was an assault on her senses, a world away from the rot and decay of her own village. It was a place of immense power and cold, untouchable grace, and she felt her own insignificance more keenly than ever. The royal guard led her through archways draped in silver moss and past fountains that flowed with enchanted water, his silence an impenetrable shield. The stares of the elven nobles they passed were like physical blows, sharp, curious, and dripping with disdain. She was a smudge of dirt on a flawless tapestry. They did not lead her to a dungeon or a courtroom, but up a winding staircase into the heart of the royal palace itself, a destination so far beyond her comprehension that it ignited a new, more profound level of terror in her soul. The throne room was not a place of warmth or comfort. It was a monument to time itself. Carved from the heartwood of a single, colossal, ancient tree, its vaulted ceilings soared into a canopy of living branches where starlight glittered like captured jewels. At its center, upon a throne of intertwined silver and ebony roots, sat King Theron. He was less a man seated upon a throne and more a natural extension of its power, an ageless figure whose silver hair cascaded over his shoulders like a frozen waterfall. His face was a study in serene authority, sculpted by millennia, yet his eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, held the crushing weight of every one of those years. An aura of immense, controlled power emanated from him, a silent pressure that filled every corner of the vast hall, making the very air heavy with his reign. His council, a collection of ancient elven lords with faces as rigid and unyielding as petrified wood, pressed their case with practiced urgency. Lord Elaraeon, his voice a dry rustle of autumn leaves, spoke of the encroaching blight and the weakening of their people's magic. Lady Lyra, her silver circlet glinting coldly, reiterated the only solution they deemed acceptable: a union with a pure-blooded bride from a noble house to produce an heir, a child whose potent magic could rejuvenate the land and their lineage. Their arguments were a familiar chorus of duty, tradition, and thinly veiled ambition, a political tide that had been rising against the shores of his resistance for decades. They spoke of the kingdom's survival, but Theron heard only the monotonous drone of stagnation, the death rattle of a world too proud to embrace change. As they spoke, Theron's gaze drifted past them, toward a vast, crystalline window that offered a view of the distant woods. He could see the creeping edges of the blight, a sickly grey pallor that leached the life from the vibrant green, and he felt it as a sympathetic ache deep within his own immortal spirit. The decay of his kingdom was a mirror, reflecting the profound weariness that had settled in his heart. He was a king trapped in a gilded cage of endless duty, his power a lonely burden. The centuries had eroded his hope, leaving behind a deep, hidden fragility, a profound loneliness that was as corrosive as the magical plague itself. He was the ageless ruler of a dying people, and the encroaching despair in the land was but an echo of the one growing within him. He resisted their calls for a pure-blooded marriage, not from defiance, but from a suffocating sense of futility. To bind himself to another ancient, passionless noble for the sake of a political solution felt like weaving the final thread in his own shroud. It was an affirmation of the very stagnation that was killing them, a doubling down on the rigid purity that had left their magic brittle and their spirits isolated. He saw the proposed union not as a source of new life, but as another gilded chain, a surrender to the slow, elegant decay he had presided over for too long. Deep within him, a silent, desperate scream for something, anything different echoed. He needed a catalyst, a wildfire to burn away the rot, not another carefully tended, sterile garden that would inevitably succumb to the same creeping frost. His mind turned to the reports that had crossed his desk, whispers from the blighted fringes of his kingdom that his council had dismissed as inconsequential. A human healer, a widow, burdened by debt and scorned by her elven neighbors, yet possessing a stubborn resilience that intrigued him. Her herbal remedies, dismissed as primitive human craft, had shown a surprising efficacy against the lesser symptoms of the blight. Succeeding where potent elven enchantments had begun to fail, she was an anomaly, an impurity, an element of chaos in a world obsessed with order. While his advisors preached of purity as their only salvation, a radical, dangerous idea began to form in Theron's mind. Perhaps the cure for his world's decay was not more of the same, but an infusion of its opposite. Mortality, imperfection, and the fierce, untamed will to survive. With a subtle, almost imperceptible lift of his hand, the council's insistent chatter ceased instantly. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the faint, magical hum of the citadel. Theron's storm-grey eyes, which had been distant and introspective, now sharpened with a sudden, unyielding resolve. He did not address the council's demands or their talk of marriage. Instead, he turned his gaze to the captain of his royal guard, a stoic figure standing motionless by the grand doors. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it resonated with the ancient power of the throne itself, a command that permitted no question. "Bring the human woman to me," he ordered, the words cutting through the tense air like shards of ice. "Bring the healer, Ilara, to the throne room, now." The great doors of the throne room swung open with a soundless, ancient grace, revealing a space so vast and cold it seemed to steal the breath from Ilara's lungs. She was a small, drab creature of dirt and herbs pushed into a world of living crystal and silver light. The eyes of the Elven Council, a gallery of impassive, sculpted faces, fell upon her like a physical weight, their disdain a palpable chill in the air, but her gaze was drawn past them, pulled by an irresistible gravity to the figure on the throne. King Theron was not merely sitting, he was an extension of the ancient wood, a being of immense stillness and power. His storm-grey eyes met hers across the expanse of polished floor, and in their depths she saw not the arrogance of a ruler, but the profound, crushing weariness of an eternity. The silence was absolute, a vacuum in which her frantic heartbeat was the only sound. With a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible, Theron commanded the room. "Leave us," he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the citadel. A murmur of protest rippled through the council. Lord Ilarion, his face a mask of rigid disapproval, took a half-step forward, his mouth opening to object to being dismissed in favor of a human commoner. But the king's gaze flickered to him for a mere second, and the unspoken challenge died in the old elf's throat. Without another word, the council members filed out, their silver robes whispering over the floor, their departing glares promising future retribution. The great doors boomed shut, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound emptiness of the hall, leaving Elara alone with the ageless power that ruled this dying land. The vast chamber instantly became a cage, beautiful and terrifying. He rose from the throne and descended the dais, not with the stiff formality of a king, but with a fluid, predatory grace that made her skin prickle with a primal fear. He was taller than she had imagined, and the closer he came, the more the aura of his power pressed in on her. He stopped a few feet away, his presence a sheer physical force that commanded her stillness. "You are the healer," he stated, his voice devoid of the scorn she was so used to. "The woman who brews remedies from the blighted soil. They say your concoctions have more success against the creeping rot than the incantations of my most learned mages." His eyes roamed over her, not with the lecherous appraisal of Valerius, but with an unnerving, analytical intensity, as if he were trying to dissect the very essence of her resilience, to understand the strange, stubborn spark of life that refused to be extinguished within her. Theron turned from her, pacing toward the immense crystalline window that overlooked his kingdom. "Look," he commanded, his voice laced with a bitterness that startled her. "My world is fading. The green heart of it sickens, and my people grow sterile and weak. My council believes the solution lies in purity. They demand I take a noble bride, sire a pure-blooded heir whose magic might turn the tide. They speak of tradition and destiny, but all I hear is the echo of our own slow suicide." He placed a hand against the cool crystal, and for a moment the regal mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the profound loneliness beneath. "They want me to reinforce the very cage that is strangling us, to seek a cure from the same source as the disease. Immortality has become our prison, Elara, and I am its most solitary inmate." He faced her again, the mask of the impassive king firmly back in place. His eyes were like chips of flint, hard and unreadable. "Your problem is a magistrate named Valerius. Your debt, the future of your son. My problem is a dying kingdom and a council of fools. I propose a solution to both." The words were dropped into the silence like stones into a deep well. "You will become my wife. You will be my queen." The offer was laid bare, stripped of all sentiment. "In return, your debts will be erased. Lord Valerius and any who threaten you will be removed. Your son will be raised in the safety of this palace, a prince of the elves, with a future beyond your wildest imaginings. You will have wealth, status, and absolute protection. In essence, I'm offering you a shield, and in return, you will be mine." The shock of his words was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. For a dizzying moment, she thought she had misheard, that this was some cruel, elaborate elven jest. Then rage, hot and fierce, surged through her. This was Valerius's proposal all over again, just wrapped in a king's silk instead of a magistrate's grime. The trade was the same. Her body, her freedom, her life, in exchange for security. "You offer a gilded cage," she whispered, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "Why? Why me? A human, an impure widow with a half-blood son. The very thing your nobles despise. Is your court so lacking in broodmares that you must stoop to the mud of the outer woods? This is madness. It is a trick, another way for a powerful man to own a powerless woman." Theron did not flinch from her accusation. Instead, a flicker of something that might have been respect appeared in his eyes. "Because you are not one of them," he answered, his voice low and intense. "Purity is not our salvation. It is our poison. It has made us brittle, stagnant. I do not need another passionless noble, another perfect sterile statue. I need a wildfire. I need your imperfection, your fierce, desperate will to live. I need your humanity, which my people have forgotten. This is not about desire, woman. It is about survival. I am not offering you a place in my bed. I am offering you a seat on a throne from which you can protect your son, and I can defy the decay that consumes us all. It is a political alliance, a desperate gambit, a contract between two cornered creatures. Ilara's mind raced, weighing the monstrous proposition. She saw Leo's terrified face, felt the phantom touch of Valerius's greedy hands, and knew there was no real choice to be made. The life he offered was a prison, but the one she had was a death sentence. Her survival, and more importantly, Leo's, depended on this impossible pact. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of ancient stone and cold power filling her senses. "I accept," she said, the words feeling alien on her tongue. The king's expression remained unchanged, but she saw a subtle release of tension in his shoulders. Then she lifted her chin, meeting his storm-tossed gaze with a fire of her own. "I accept on one condition. This union is a shield, as you say, not a marriage of truth. Therefore, you will never touch me without my explicit consent. You may own my name, but you will not own my body." For a king, the ceremony was an act of profound and deliberate simplicity, a stark statement to his court. There was no grand cathedral, no chorus of elven singers, no gathering of noble houses to bear witness. Instead, the union was sealed in the cold, echoing silence of the royal scriptorium, a chamber that smelled of ancient vellum and drying ink. The contract, a document detailing the transfer of Ilara's debts to the crown and the bestowal of the title of Queen Consort, was laid out between them on a massive oak table. Theron's signature was a series of sharp, elegant runes, affixed with the weight of centuries. When Ilara took the quill, her hand trembled, the tip spattering a tiny, dark tear of ink onto the parchment. It felt less like a signature and more like a surrender. The scratching of the nib against the page, the only sound in the room, sealing her fate with an icy finality. The announcement was made not to a cheering public, but to the assembled council in the throne room, the same stony-faced nobles who had been dismissed hours before. Theron stood before them, Ilara, a small, silent shadow at his side, and declared their union complete. A venomous silence descended upon the chamber, thicker and more menacing than any outcry. Lord Elarian's face became a mask of glacial fury, his knuckles white where he gripped the arm of his chair. Lady Lyra's perfect lips thinned into a bloodless line, her eyes like chips of obsidian, promising a cold and patient war. It was not merely disapproval, it was a declaration of hostilities. In their eyes, Theron had not just taken a wife, he had defiled the throne, polluted their sacred lineage, and invited a human blight into the very heart of their citadel. The air crackled with their unspoken, unified condemnation. Their first public appearance as king and queen was on the grand balcony overlooking the central plaza. The news had spread through the citadel like a contagion, and a sea of pale, elegant elven faces stared up at them, their expressions a mixture of stunned disbelief and open contempt. There were no cheers, only a vast collective murmur, a sibilant whisper that slithered through the air like 1,000 tiny snakes. Ilara felt each unblinking stare as a physical touch, a cold probe seeking out her human flaws. She instinctively reached for Leo, who was clutching her hand, his small face pale and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the silent hostility. This was not a celebration of a royal wedding. It was the public unveiling of a king's madness, and she was the living, breathing symbol of his inexplicable transgression, a piece of dirt presented on a silver platter. Amidst the suffocating wave of disapproval from the crowd below, Theron made his first move as her husband and protector. His hand, which had been held stiffly at his side, moved to the small of her back. The touch was not intimate or romantic. It was a firm, possessive, and utterly public claim. A shock of warmth spread through the thin fabric of her dress, a current of unexpected energy that made her straighten her spine. It was a silent, unambiguous message to the thousands of watching eyes. She is mine. She is protected. The murmuring below did not cease, but it faltered, a subtle shift in the atmosphere as the raw, undeniable power of the king's will imposed itself upon the scene. For the first time, Ilara felt not like an offering, but like a piece on the board that had been moved by a master player. Shielded by his strength, the walk from the balcony to the royal apartments was the longest of Ilara's life. The corridors of the palace, once filled with the curious, disdainful stares of courtiers, were now eerily empty. Servants and guards flattened themselves against the walls as they passed, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to meet her gaze. The silence between her and Theron was a living thing, a chasm of unspoken fears and unnegotiable terms. The only sounds were the soft scuff of her worn leather shoes on the polished marble and the near-silent tread of his royal boots, a constant reminder of the worlds that separated them. Every step took her further from the woman she had been and deeper into the gilded cage he had constructed for her. A queen in name, a prisoner in truth, walking toward a night that promised no comfort, only a terrifying new form of solitude. The royal chambers were a breathtaking prison of silk and silver. Woven tapestries depicting ancient elven victories covered the walls, their threads seeming to mock her common origins. A fire crackled in a hearth carved from a single piece of white marble, but it offered no warmth against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. In a small antechamber, Leo was asleep on a bed so large and soft he seemed to be sinking into it, a single elven attendant watching over him with impassive eyes. This was the prize for her sacrifice, his safety. But seeing him there, so small and out of place amidst the cold splendor, felt like another kind of wound. She had saved him from the magistrate's hovel, only to place him in a beautiful, soulless museum, where he would be just as much of an outcast as she was. A half-blood prince in a court that worshipped purity. The heavy doors to the chambers closed behind them, the sound of the latch clicking into place, a definitive, echoing finality that severed them from the rest of the world. The public performance was over. Theron turned to face her, the immense space of the room feeling suddenly small and suffocating. His storm-grey eyes were unreadable, the mask of the king firmly in place. "The pact is sealed," he said, his voice a low, even tone that held no trace of emotion. "Oh, you are the queen. Your son is a prince of this realm. No harm will come to either of you within these walls. Your duties will be explained to you in the morning. For now, these are your chambers. I will reside in the adjoining suite." He was laying out the terms of their cohabitation, drawing the lines of their shared prison with cold, precise words, ensuring the emotional chasm between them remained as wide as the political one. He turned to leave, his duty as he saw it done, but he hesitated at the door to his own chambers. He looked back at her, standing small and defiant in the center of the vast, opulent room. For a fleeting second, something in his expression shifted. Perhaps it was the flicker of terror in her eyes that she could not hide, or perhaps it was the sheer, stubborn resilience that had drawn him to her in the first place. He walked back toward her, and her entire body tensed, her hand clenching into a fist at her side. But he did not reach for her in anger or passion. Instead, he lifted a hand and gently, almost hesitantly, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, his fingers long and cool, a shocking moment of tenderness in the frozen landscape of their arrangement. The unexpected gentleness of his touch disarmed her more than any command could have. She stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat, seeing for the first time a flicker of something other than regal authority in his ancient eyes. There was a profound weariness there, a loneliness that seemed to echo her own. "I gave you my word, Ilara," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its royal resonance. "No one will harm you here, not the council, not the court, not even your king." The promise was a shield, offered not from a throne, but from a place of shared captivity. In that moment, he was not the all-powerful monarch who had bought her, but another cornered creature, fighting for the survival of something he feared was already lost. The gesture was a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the vulnerable man beneath the crown. Before she could process the shift between them, he leaned down. Elara braced herself for a cold, formal kiss to seal their pact, a final branding of ownership. But the pressure of his lips on hers was anything but. It was brief. Yet it was a collision of desperation and surprise. There was no love in it, but there was a spark of searing heat, a raw, unspoken acknowledgement of the volatile forces they had unleashed. It was not a kiss of passion, but of shared desperation, a frantic, searching question asked in the dark. When he pulled back, his eyes were darker, more turbulent than before. He left without another word, leaving her standing alone, her heart hammering against her ribs. The touch, the promise, the kiss, it was all a terrifying revelation. This would never be just an agreement. The boundaries of their contract had already been set on fire. The days that followed settled into a strange, disquieting rhythm, a life lived within the gilded bars of a beautiful cage. Elara found a small measure of solace in the royal gardens, a secluded sanctuary of shimmering flora that responded to her touch with a vibrancy the rest of the blighted kingdom had lost. Here, she could almost forget the cold and assessing stares of the court. She would spend hours tending to the silver-leafed herbs and moon-petal blossoms, her hands finding comfort in the familiar feel of soil, her knowledge of healing finding new purpose. From a high balcony, Theron would often watch her, a solitary figure observing the splash of human color she brought to his sterile, grey world. He saw not the commoner his court despised, but a stubborn, inexplicable flicker of life in the heart of his dying citadel, a mystery he found himself increasingly compelled to understand. Leo, however, struggled against the rigid perfection of elven court life. His boyish energy was a discordant note in the palace's silent, graceful symphony. During a formal dinner, he fidgeted, dropping a silver fork with a clatter that echoed like a thunderclap in the vast hall. The glares from the assembled nobles were immediate and sharp, another mark against his mother's unsuitability. Elara's heart clenched with shame and fear for him, but before she could whisper a reprimand, Theron acted. He deliberately knocked his own goblet, spilling a drop of crimson wine. He caught Leo's terrified gaze and gave him a slow, almost imperceptible wink. Later, he found the boy in the library and, without a word, showed him how to play an ancient elven strategy game with polished riverstones, a quiet act of inclusion that spoke more than any royal decree of acceptance ever could. The council's disdain was a more formal, cutting kind of cruelty. During her first official meeting as Queen Consort, Lord Elarion, the most ancient and venomous of Theron's advisors, turned the discussion to the blight. He spoke of failing enchantments and ancient wards, then turned his gaze upon her, his voice dripping with condescension. Our new queen, I believe, has some experience with rustic remedies. Perhaps she could enlighten this council with a peasant superstition to cure what millennia of elven magic cannot. The chamber filled with the sound of stifled, mocking laughter. Elara felt her blood run cold, her voice trapped in her throat. She was a specimen on display, her knowledge and her very identity reduced to a source of amusement for these ageless, arrogant beings who had already judged and dismissed her. Before the humiliation could fully settle, Theron's voice cut through the air, as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Lord Elarion," he said, his tone dangerously soft, "you forget yourself. You are not addressing a peasant. You are addressing your queen." He did not raise his voice, yet the power behind the words silenced the room instantly. "Her counsel on this matter was not offered. It was commanded by your king. You will afford her the respect her station demands, or you will find yourself discussing the blight from a far less comfortable position." He did not look at Ilara, his gaze fixed on the council, but the message was a shield thrown around her. The nobles fell silent, their mockery replaced by a simmering, resentful obedience. Ilara sat straighter, her fear momentarily replaced by a dizzying mix of gratitude and awe at the sheer, absolute force of his will. Later, in the suffocating silence of their shared apartments, the tension from the council meeting still clung to them like a shroud. Ilara wanted to thank him, but the words felt hollow, inadequate for the sheer scale of the public defense he had mounted. He found her staring out a window, her reflection a pale ghost against the darkening sky. He did not offer comfort or platitudes. Instead, he began to speak of the council, of their ancient lineages, their intertwined ambitions, and their deep-seated fear of change. He laid out the political board for her, not as a husband to a wife, but as a general to a new, unproven lieutenant. It was the most he had ever revealed of his own burdens, an admission that he, too, was trapped in this game. In that moment, their contract felt less like a transaction and more like a desperate two-person alliance against a world of enemies. The court's animosity, however, could not be so easily commanded. At a grand harvest feast, Lady Lyra, the noblewoman Theron was expected to marry, saw her chance for a more personal attack. As Ilara passed, carrying a goblet of water for Leo, Lyra stumbled, accidentally spilling a cascade of dark, blood-red wine down the front of Ilara's simple, pale dress. The stain bloomed like a grotesque flower. "Oh, my sincerest apologies," Lyra said, her voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear, her eyes glittering with malice. "How clumsy of me. But then, some things are so easily stained, aren't they? So quick to show their impurities." The insult was exquisitely cruel, a public branding of Ilara's human blood and her unworthiness. The hall fell into a hushed, expectant silence, every eye watching to see how the human queen would react to her public shaming. Theron rose from the high table. A wave of absolute silence followed his movement. He did not stride or storm. He flowed down the steps with a lethal grace that promised retribution. He stopped before Ilara, who stood frozen, the dark stain a testament to her humiliation. He gently took the stained fabric of her bodice between his long, elegant fingers. The court held its collective breath, expecting him to cast her aside in disgust. Instead, he lifted the wine-soaked cloth to his lips and pressed a deliberate, lingering kiss upon it. He then raised his eyes, pinning Lady Lyra with a gaze as cold as the void between stars. "What you perceive as a stain, Lady Lyra," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled the hall, "I see as a mark of vibrant life in a court that has grown deathly pale. Be careful your own purity does not cause you to fade away entirely." The aftermath of his defense left a new, more volatile tension in its wake. Back in the privacy of their chambers, the space between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with politics or pacts. Ilara stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her, honored her, and utterly destroyed his enemy in her name. The line they had so carefully drawn between them, the cold, hard boundary of their contract, had been consumed by a wildfire. "Why?" she whispered. The single word encompassing a universe of confusion. He took a step closer, his storm-grey eyes searching her face, and she saw the same question reflected there. In that moment, the terrifying realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Are we even pretending anymore? That night, sleep was a distant country neither of them could reach. Ilara found him on a remote balcony, a solitary silhouette against a sky of cold, distant stars. He was staring toward the blighted lands, the source of his kingdom's decay and his own deep-seated despair. "Sometimes," he said, his voice rough with a weariness she had never heard before, I feel its coldness inside my own veins, a slow, endless winter. The confession was an offering, a piece of his soul laid bare. She found herself responding in kind, speaking not of her debts, but of her deepest fear, that Leo would inherit a world without hope, that her love would not be enough to protect him from the encroaching shadows. He turned to her, and in the moonlight his hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. It was a simple, quiet touch, yet it was the most profoundly intimate gesture of her life. Their growing, undeniable bond did not go unnoticed. Lord Elarion and Lady Lyra, thwarted in their direct assaults, shifted their strategy. They could no longer attack the Queen without attacking the King's judgment, a dangerous proposition. So they began to champion her position, but with a venomous twist. Whispers turned from her unsuitability to her solemn duty. The blight, they argued, was a spiritual and magical decay born of a weakened bloodline. If the king had chosen this human as a catalyst, then the union must be consecrated, its purpose fulfilled. The court began to murmur not of Elara's flaws, but of the kingdom's pressing, desperate need for a new heir, a child of both worlds, a magical cure. The pressure was no longer about pushing Elara out, it was about forcing her into the one role she had explicitly forbidden, a broodmare for the throne. The new assault came not as an insult, but as a formal public petition. The entire council, led by a gravely concerned Lord Elarion, assembled in the throne room. With Elara seated beside Theron, they bypassed all previous hostilities and spoke with a chillingly unified voice of loyalty and desperation. "Your Majesty," Elarion began, bowing low, "the people grow fearful. The land weakens. Your union has brought a spark of hope, but it must be fanned into a flame. For the sake of the kingdom, we must ask, when can we expect the succession to be secured? When will the Queen fulfill her sacred duty and provide this realm with an heir?" The question was a perfectly laid trap, a public demand that weaponized their own arrangement against them, forcing the issue of their physical intimacy into the political arena. Elara's breath caught in her throat. The room felt airless, the weight of 1,000 years of tradition and expectation pressing down on her. This was a checkmate. To deny the intention of producing an heir would be to admit their marriage was a sham, giving the council the exact ammunition they needed to depose them both. To agree would be to violate the one condition she had set, the one piece of herself she had refused to sell. She looked at Theron, and for the first time she saw the king trapped, his immense power bound by the chains of their own making. He was silent for a long, agonizing moment, the fate of his reign balanced on a razor's edge. Finally, he rose, his face an unreadable mask of stone, and looked down upon his council. "Your concern for the realm is noted," he declared, his voice booming with regal finality. "The preparations for the sacred rite of union will begin at once." The king's decree echoed in the vast, silent space of their chambers, a death knell for the fragile truce they had built. After Theron's public declaration, a chasm of ice opened between them. He retreated behind the mask of the monarch, his movements precise and his words clipped, discussing the impending rite of union as if it were a military strategy. He spoke of schedules, ceremonial robes, and public appearances, his voice a cold, dispassionate drone that stripped all humanity from the act. Elara watched him, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. This was not the man who had kissed a wine stain from her dress or shared his loneliness under the stars. This was the king who had bought her, and he was now coming to collect the final, most intimate part of his purchase. The promise he had made, that he would never touch her, had been shattered not by force, but by a chillingly brilliant political maneuver, leaving her more trapped than ever before. Her silence finally broke, the words tearing from her throat in a ragged whisper that quickly grew into a furious accusation. "You lied to me," she seethed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This is no different from Valerius. You've just wrapped the cage in silk and gold. My body is still the price. The one thing I asked for, the one piece of myself I refused to sell, and you parade it before your council as the solution to all your problems. You stood there and agreed to use me, to force me into a sacred rite that is a complete and utter sham. You violated the very heart of our agreement, the one boundary that made this prison bearable. Did you ever intend to honor your word, or was I always just a means to an end for you? A human broodmare to secure your throne and save your dying world?" Pushed to a breaking point by the raw, undeniable truth in her accusation, the king's stoic facade finally cracked. He turned on her, his eyes a tempest of ancient pain and desperation. "You think this is about a throne, about an heir?" he bit out, his voice raw with a torment that stunned her into silence. "There is a prophecy, Ilara, a truth my council conveniently ignores. The blight is not just a sickness of the land, it is a reflection of its king. It feeds on my solitude, on the sterile, unchanging nature of my immortal heart. The rite of union is not merely a ceremony, it is a magical conduit. The prophecy states that only a true, heartfelt union between two worlds, one of ancient, weary power and one of vibrant, mortal life, can sever my spirit from the decay and heal the land. I did not choose you as a broodmare. I chose you as a desperate, impossible hope." The revelation struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow, shattering her rage and leaving a terrifying clarity in its wake. This was infinitely more dangerous than a political sham. He had gambled the fate of his entire kingdom not on a lie, but on the desperate hope that a genuine connection could form between them, a bond powerful enough to fuel an ancient, world-saving magic. The weight of his confession settled upon her, a crushing, unbearable burden. Their dilemma was no longer about personal survival or political maneuvering. If they proceeded with the rite as a lie, the magic would undoubtedly fail, dooming the realm and exposing them as frauds. But to admit the truth of their arrangement now, to confess that their union was a desperate pact and not a budding love, would hand the council the very weapon they needed to tear them apart and seize control. With the truth laid bare between them, the last of their emotional defenses crumbled into dust. "When I saw you in the garden," Theron confessed, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on her as if she were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. "When I saw the life that bloomed under your touch, my desperate gambit became something else. It became a hope for myself. The fear I feel is not of my council, Ilara. It is the terror that I will fail you, that my own endless winter will extinguish the very fire I need to survive." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes as she took a hesitant step toward him. "And I," she admitted, her voice thick with unshed emotion, "thought my heart was a ruin. But your protection, the glimpses of the man drowning beneath the crown, you made me feel a safety I thought I would never know again. You made me feel—" Before the final, unspoken word could be uttered, the clear, piercing sound of a silver trumpet cut through the air from the plaza below. The call was a summons, an unavoidable demand from the world outside their private crisis. The public gathering for the announcement of the rite of union had begun. They were out of time. They looked at each other, the half-formed confession hanging between them, a fragile, impossible thing in the face of the monumental lie they were about to tell or the catastrophic truth they might be forced to reveal. Theron extended a hand, his expression a mask of grim resolve overlaying a sea of turmoil. Together, they walked toward the great doors of the balcony, stepping out of their intimate storm and into the expectant silence of the entire kingdom, the fate of everything resting on their next words. The air on the grand balcony was sharp and cold, a tangible manifestation of the kingdom's expectant silence. Below them, a sea of pale elven faces stared up, their collective gaze a heavy, suffocating blanket. To their side, on a raised dais, the council watched with the vulture-like stillness of those who believe their trap has been perfectly sprung. Elara felt Theron's hand on the small of her back, not a gesture of ownership this time, but a silent, desperate anchor in the storm of 1,000 unblinking eyes. They stood as a united front, king and queen, but beneath the regal facade was a terrifying precipice. They could either leap into a lie that would doom them all, or confess a truth that would tear their world, and each other, apart. The weight of their impossible choice pressed down, threatening to shatter the fragile bond they had only just begun to acknowledge in the privacy of their chambers. Theron did not address the council, whose smug expressions already anticipated their victory. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the thousands of his subjects gathered below, his voice resonating not with the cold command of a king, but with the weary conviction of a soul unburdened. "You have been told that our kingdom withers because of a blight in the soil," he began, his words carrying to the furthest corners of the plaza. "You are mistaken. The true blight is one of the spirit, a sickness of stagnation born from a brittle pride and the worship of a purity that has left us cold and passionless. We have prized our immortality while forgetting how to truly live." He then turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Elara, and his voice softened, yet grew in power. "I did not choose this woman to appease a tradition. I chose her because her fierce, mortal heart holds more life than this entire court combined." Ignoring the sputtering rage that twisted Lord Elarian's face into a grotesque mask, Theron turned fully to Elara, making the vast public stage an impossibly intimate space. The world fell away, the crowd and the council fading into a blur of insignificance. "They believe I brought you here to be a political tool, a vessel for an heir," he said, his voice for her alone, yet heard by all. "They are wrong. I did not choose you to save my kingdom, Elara. I chose you to save myself from the ageless winter of my own soul. Your strength, your compassion, your refusal to break. You were a fire in the encroaching cold." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin as a single tear escaped her eye. "The prophecy was never about bloodlines. It was about love. And I, who thought myself incapable of it, love you." The world narrowed to the space between their eyes, his confession a key turning in the rusted lock of her own barricaded heart. The fear, the pact, the anger, it all dissolved into the profound, staggering truth of his words. "I was a ruin," she whispered back, her voice trembling but clear, a vow spoken to him and to the world. "A woman haunted by ghosts and cornered by fear. I believed your palace was just another cage, but you built a sanctuary around me with your protection, your quiet kindness, your hidden pain. You saw a healer when everyone else saw a stain." As her words met his, a collective gasp swept through the crowd. A single brilliant beam of sunlight broke through the oppressive grey clouds, illuminating a long dead vine snaking up the balcony's stone railing. Before their very eyes, a vibrant green leaf unfurled, a miracle of life in the heart of decay. He framed her face with his hands, his storm-grey eyes now clear of all shadows, reflecting only her. The kiss was not one of desperation or surprise, but of absolute certainty, a sealing of souls in the face of an entire kingdom. It was a promise, a prayer, and a declaration of war against the fading of the light. As their lips met, a current of pure, unbridled life seemed to surge from them, a warmth that radiated out from the balcony, a tangible wave of hope that washed over the stunned onlookers. The single green leaf was joined by another, and then another, the ancient vine trembling with a sudden, impossible rush of vitality. On the dais, the faces of Lord Elarian and Lady Lyra were no longer smug, but etched in the stone of their own obsolescence, their world of cold purity shattered by a simple, profound human emotion. Spring returned to the elven lands not as a season, but as a promise fulfilled. The blight receded like a forgotten nightmare, leaving behind a world reborn in vibrant, impossible greens. In the royal gardens, where life had first answered her touch, Theron watched Elara as she taught a laughing Leo the names of the moon-petal blossoms. The crushing weight of millennia had lifted from the king's shoulders, the storm in his eyes replaced by the calm, clear light of a new dawn. He came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as his hand came to rest protectively over her gently swelling abdomen, a silent testament to the new life they had created for their kingdom and for themselves. Theirs was a story not of a pact made in desperation, but of a love destined to heal a broken king and a dying land. If their journey has moved you, please show your support by liking this video, commenting with your favorite moment, and subscribing for more tales of love against all odds.